we had some, we have,
Oh, good.
we've had a few technical difficulties. Ryan, our usual technical guru, is not feeling well today. And so he's not with us. And so we're trying to fill in from the other side as to how this is all going to work. In the meantime, we'll get started. You know, if Denise has some connection problems too, so it may be that from time to time her connection fails, and we'll just work on getting her back and try to make this work one way or the other. All right. So Denise Lajimodiere.
Yeah, very good.
Lajimodiere. Denise Lajimodiere is our guest today, and she is going to be talking to us about the boarding schools. And she has basically a whole presentation that she's used to giving. And at the end of her presentation, we will have a chance for some question and answers and our usual conversation. But I think her subject is such that, you know, for most of us, we don't really have a clue, you know, and so it's hard to wrap your head around something that you haven't really given thought to, and especially something as sensitive as today's issue. So I hope that you will listen intently, and if you have questions, as questions arise, maybe try to write some of them down so that you know, we're not kind of grasping at the end. So as you have questions, make note of them, and we'll get back to them. With that said, I know she has a whole bunch of stuff to talk about, but tell us just a thumbnail sketch, Denise, about who you are and how you came to focus on this work.
Bonjour, Anin, Wabishka Benes, Ikwe, Wanakwat, Dejanakaz, Ashijak, Nidodem, Mikanakwa-Jun, and Dunjiba. I'm Dr. Denise Lajimodiere. I'm from the Turtle Mountain Reservation, where I live now since I retired as an associate professor from NDSU in educational leadership. And my tribal name, my Ojibwe name is
Oh, she froze. So she said that that's probably might be what happened. So can you hear us, Denise, at all? Maybe her other computer kind of blanked out on her last night, and so she's having a stand-in computer, and she said, well, that one is working, but kind of, you know. So I hope we don't have to struggle too much with this. She said she would go out. Oh, there she is. She's back again. You turn on your mic though. Turn on your mic. Oh,
okay.
there you go. Okay.
So my parents and my grandparents, listening to stories of them tell about boarding.
Wait. We lost a whole bunch of you. So you were just at saying my Ojibwe name is.
Is Morningstar, our white thundercloud woman, and I'm from the Turtle Mountain Reservation, and my clan is Crane. So did you get where my parents, my interest in boarding schools came from my parents' story. From my father, my mother, and all my grandfathers were sent to boarding schools. So when I became a professor, one of my leading research agendas was researching boarding schools, and that was from 2006 on. So I interviewed elders, survivors of boarding schools, and I came up with, I published everything in the book from NDSU Press, and it's called Stringing Rosaries, the history, the unforgivable, and the healing of Northern Plains American Indian boarding school survivors. So this is the research that I'll be talking about today.
Okay. Well, with that, I'll turn it over to you for what you want to say to us today.
First of all, for those of you in the audience that may be boarding school survivors, I will read this. For many, these topics that I'm going to discuss here we call painful memories. Feelings of anger, sadness, or disbelief are understandable and warranted. I want to caution readers that this presentation may trigger responses in you related to your own trauma and possible painful family history. If what is revealed here brings up emotional pain for you, I encourage you to seek support or help from a trusted source. So I'm going to give a brief history, and we talk about 40 minutes. I'm cutting down like an hour and a half live presentation to about 40 minutes, so it's going to go pretty quick. And then we'll open up for questions, but hopefully I'll answer some of your questions during the presentation. So this is what I call America's best kept secret. First of all, I'll talk about the finding of the unmarked graves in Kamloops, our First Nations relatives across the medicine line. I belong and helped organize in 2011 the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And so we've been working for over a decade trying to bring boarding school issues to a national attention, over a decade, but it took finding the bodies of these babies. Well, we always knew they were there. It wasn't a shock or a surprise or anything to Indigenous people. So it took that to bring this to a national attention in both Canada. Our Canadian First Nations relatives said, well, you better look south to the United States. The same thing happened there. And we are going, yes, we have unmarked graves here in the US. I know many boarding schools where there are unmarked graves. So I'm glad that it became a national issue finally, but sad in the way that it had to happen. So I've had interviews from China and from Al Jazeera English and from Australia. She may come up here to interview here. So this has gone internationally about what happened in the boarding school era through United States policy. So a brief history is that the US had an Indian problem. It was too expensive to keep a war campaign. It was up to $1 million for the cavalry to initiate a cultural genocide. The only good Indian is a dead Indian. So in 1869, President Grant announced his Indian peace policy, which allowed religious denominations to undertake the work of civilizing the Indians. The Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions established boarding schools both on and off the reservation. So I have 13 Christian denominations that had boarding schools: Methodist, I'll just name a few, Episcopalian, Catholics, of course, Congregationalists, Lutherans, and Quakers. So there's more. 1891, Congress authorized the Commission of Indian Affairs to enforce compulsory attendance of Indian children and to withhold rations, clothing, and other annuities of guardians that refused to send and keep their children in school. So it was a forced removal. I call it a stolen generation. My father's mother died in the 1918 flu epidemic. So he was raised by a full-blood Cree couple just here on the reservation, just south of here, a little ways. And they hid him till he was 9 years old. If you read Stringing Rosaries, the last chapter is about an essay about my father. So they hid him. When the Indian agent would come, they would tell him, "Pimbasta, run, Nushishim, run, grandchild," and he would run and hide in the bush. They finally threatened him with threatened the family to remove the rations and not even their wood. So and here in North Dakota, of course, they would freeze and starve to death. So they sent him 3 days and 3 nights to Chemawa, Oregon. So in 1879, Captain Richard Pratt makes his appearance. His beliefs were that he agrees with the sentiment, the only good Indian is a good Indian. He said, I agree with that, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. So the famous saying, kill the Indian in him and save the man. So he started Carlisle, and there's a whole story before that of how he got Native kids into Carlisle in 1879. In 1880, his buddy that he was in the Civil War with, Wilkinson, wanted to start a boarding school out in the West Coast. Carlisle is in the East Coast and Chemawa is in the West Coast. So he started Chemawa in 1880, and that's where my father was sent in 1925. So that's just a brief history. So for my research, what I did as a professor is called a qualitative interview study. And I just put something in the newspapers around the 3 states and around mostly in North Dakota, and asked people who, if they wanted to talk about their boarding school experience, whether good or bad, to contact me. So I've interviewed over 20 people, and 16 of the interviews made it into the book, Stringing Rosaries. So what I did was I would sit with you and I would interview you from the time you were born until now. Some of them were 79, 80 years old. I think my auntie was like 86 years old. And because I wanted to hear what your life was like before you went to boarding school, why you were sent to boarding school, what happened during boarding school, and then how your life has been since then, impacted since then. So when you do a qualitative interview study, you kind of shake it out so that certain themes rise to the top. So the themes, I'll go over them along with some vignettes of what the people said, and just trigger warning, some of this can be pretty tough. So one of the themes was that I experienced loss of identity. Of course, it was kill the Indian and save the man. He would say all the Indian in you is dead. So they were shamed, ridiculed, and punished. One of the most egregious is a loss of language. Like Papa did not speak English, neither did my mom when they went to boarding school. So they were forced to speak English. Some of them had lye soap put in their mouth and held their lips closed until blisters were formed in their mouth. They were hit with rulers, broken fingers, ears were ripped. Josephine says, when I was 5 years old, I was put on a bus that took me to St. Joseph's. I didn't speak English very well. They lined us up and asked me my grandparents' name was. I said, Musham and Cookum, and that's in our tribal language. And the nun hit me over the head and knocked me to the floor. So my mom was locked in a closet because she wouldn't speak English, but she said, I didn't care. I liked it in there. And when she'd come home, she'd be speaking English, and grandma would tell her, talk like a human being, talk our tribal language. So growing up, grandma helped raise us. She would speak our tribal language to my mom, and my mom would speak English. My father never spoke his language again, and neither did my mom. So that's, hundreds of thousands of Native people. We don't speak our languages because our parents told us, we didn't want you to go through the hell that we went through in learning how to speak English. So some of them had, pins put through their tongues, put in dungeons, and talk about that in a bit. So then, of course, their clothes were burned, anything that they went to school with. The hair was cut. Kerosene was put, kerosene and DDT was put in the kids' hair after it was shaved, and of course their scalp would burn. So another theme was, of course, the loss of culture, ceremonies, and traditions. Both Pratt liked Indians, but he hated the culture. So they were both, him and Wilkinson were rabid assimilationists. There's loss of self-esteem. Julia said that the teacher made me feel ashamed for being Indian, and that is still with me today. Some students internalized boarding school messages that told them to feel ashamed of their identities, parents, and communities. So they still have to this day internalized oppression of self-hate. So loneliness, of course, like my dad was sent, 3 days and 3 nights away from his family. He never got to go home for 4 years, which was common. Some of the kids were in boarding schools up to 12 years. They had a program called the outing program, where they were sent out to farms during the summer and not allowed to go home because he didn't want them to go back into the culture, the traditions, the ceremonies, and the language. So my dad said that sometimes they'd wake up and a boy would be dead, a little boy. He lived in a little boy's dorm. And I said, what happened, Papa? And he said that they just died of loneliness. So now we know that that's failure to thrive. They just stopped eating. They were terribly lonely. And of course, they ran away. They committed suicide. Dad said a kid committed suicide on the railroad tracks that were in front of the school, that the train that brought him to boarding schools. And then they didn't understand why their parents had sent them to boarding school, so they felt abandoned by parents. Roger said, when I was younger, I always wondered why my parents hated me. Why did they do that to me, sent me there? So there's a lot of reasons why kids were sent to boarding school. Some were forced into boarding school. Sometimes this one agent just came into a person's home. I think there was 12 kids there, and they were fine. They were parents were there, but the agents just said, you, and you. And he took 4 of the 12 kids that just happened to be in the living room and threw them into the van and took them off to Chimawa. They were from Northern California. So some wanted to go. Well, my cousins were there. So I want to go, but they didn't know the hell that they were getting themselves into. So some were, had to, even in the 70s, they weren't given a choice of going to stay with grandparents or extended family. They were just loaded up by social services, thrown on a bus and taken to boarding school. They did not have a choice. So the second overarching theme was the abuse and the corporal punishment at these schools. So Pratt based his schools on a military style of discipline. My father said that from he started at 9 years old. He's a little tiny skinny guy. He would have to march with a wooden gun. They marched everywhere. Pratt was military discipline to the max. So he had to march everywhere with a little wooden gun. As he got older, he was there for 4 years. As he got older, he would march with a metal gun. So they marched everywhere, and he marched to bells and whistles, to revelry. Back then in 1925, it was just completely military style. So I go to Fort Taunton a lot, which is just south of here on the Spirit Lake Reservation. It was a fort. Custer was there, 7th Cavalry was there, but then it was when they left, they turned it into a federal boarding school. And of course, there's no separation of church and state. The Grey Nuns were there also, teaching or giving lessons and so on in the school. So I'd heard stories of dungeons, what the elders, people my age that interviewed, that talked to their father's stories, said that they were thrown into dungeons in Fort Taunton under the boys' dorm, under the steps. So Fort Taunton is, the fort is a historic North Dakota Historical Society site. So I go there, and there's a couple of young people that work there now, and they let me in, with the keys to places that tourists can't go, because the buildings are crumbling, some are falling down, and some are remodeled through oil money, which has since stopped. But anyway, so they're remodeling. So I found three dungeons that are underneath the boys' dorm where these kids were thrown. My one friend, her last name is Flying Eagle. She said that her father was thrown in there for not speaking English, but then he would start singing Sundance songs or Ojibwe songs at the top of his lungs, and they would keep him down there longer. And when he came out, they would only give him water. Of course, he was weak, but he also didn't even know what day it was. So there's 2 dorms. There's 2 places underneath, one underneath the steps. And then another elder named Oliver said that across the Cavalry Square in the superintendent's office, he was put down underneath the floorboards there. And we went there recently, and the maintenance men, young native maintenance men there, crawled around down there, and I was able to walk down the steps down there. Also, there were steps. There was we could see the hole in the floor, and we had to pry it up, but there was actually steps going down there. So pretty horrific, just at that one school. So there's also something called a gauntlet, which nearly killed my dad and did kill a Blackfeet man. So my father, he teased about the dorm matron and the guy that worked there that they were having a case, which back in the 1920s meant they liked each other. Someone overheard him, and Pratt had set it up so that the older kids that were there would rat on the younger ones. So they laid him over a bed and held his arms and his feet, and the boys had to take a belt and hit him on his back as hard as they could. If you let up, then you would have to take his place. So they killed the kid by rupturing his kidneys doing that, Dad said, and then he ended up in the infirmary for a couple of weeks because his back was so torn up. So that's called the gauntlet, and that was pretty much across all boarding schools that they did that. So Cecilia said, when I first arrived at Wahpeton, I was 5 years old. A girl was on a swing and her foot accidentally hit the water. The matron beat her with a horsewhip on the legs and then her back. She was cut open and bleeding. The other famous one is kneeling on a broomstick. They'd make you kneel on a broomstick if you were bad. Oh God, that hurt. And you better not move or they come over and pull your hair. So I kneel on a broomstick. I kneeled on it from 1 o'clock on Saturday to 4:30. If I tried to sit back, I got kicked in the ass. When I stood up, I could hardly stand. My tendons were just, oh my God. For speaking, this is Demas, and sadly, he was interviewed in the book, and sadly, he he passed away with COVID. So I'm just devastated. For speaking Dakota, he had to kneel on a ruler with my hands in front of my face. If I tried to lean back and sit on my heels, the father would grab my hair and hold it straight up. So to this day, to the day he died, he wouldn't speak Dakota in public, even though he did speak his language. Because if he started speaking his language in public, he could feel that priest jerking his hair and his skin in the back of his neck. So that's the reason why so many of us, don't speak our tribal language. So that's called stress torture. They use that in the army, or to torture Americans, to torture prisoners, called stress torture. So some boys, my dad said some boys ran away, and they came back, and they brought him into the cafeteria. The 4 boys, they tied their arms together, their hands together, and threw a rope over a beam and lifted the boys up to where their toes couldn't even touch the floor for running away. So my dad vowed not to ever run away. So one of them, if you peed the bed, you had to put your sheets over you, or you got your face rubbed into the wet sheets, or you had to walk with it to, they shamed you out if you wet the bed. So this one day, someone had put their pee sheets in the closet, and the nuns found it. So no one would own up to it. So she had the girls pee in a bucket, and then she slammed all the girls' faces into the pee bucket. And that was fairly recent, like in the 60s. Oh, so there's more sickness and illnesses. So the kids died. That's the reason why there's cemeteries at boarding schools, because kids died there. They died of tuberculosis, measles, pneumonia, flu, typhoid. They had jaundice. They had impetigo. They had trachoma, eye conditions. So, and there's a memo out before 1900 from the Department of Interior to the federal boarding schools that existed at that time, and the head of the department said that there will be no more sending kids home when they die because they can't afford it. And if you apply for that expense to send a body home, that it will be denied. So that's a big reason why there are kids, why there are cemeteries at these schools. Chimawa has over 220. I go there often because my dad, they decided to train him to be a carpenter. He was good at math. Once he learned English, he was good at math. And he did become a carpenter all his life. And I always wonder, other boarding schools had kids that worked in that area make the coffins for the kids that died there. So I always wonder, I never asked him. He died in 1993. That's a question I didn't think to ask him if he had to build but I look at the graves of the kids that died while he was there, and there's quite a few. So that was forced child labor. So the schools didn't provide enough money to support the kids, or to support the operation of the school. So the kids went to school half a day, and then they went to their detail or to the work. So there was all kinds of different types of labor they worked in. So it was forced child labor there. So the solution was to have the students build and repair the buildings, maintain the barns, garden, clean, cook, laundry, sewing, janitors, and work in the fields. So they didn't get a good education, they said, because they, when were they in class? So then also the kids were always hungry, and Dad said there was slop that they ate, and there was often worms, even though they worked in the fields, onion fields, berries, and so on. That was to support the school. It wasn't to feed the kids. So if you vomited, you were made to eat your vomit, or you got your face rubbed in it. So Julia said for breakfast, they put a box of cereal on the table, and there's like 10 of us, and whoever got the end of the box, there was nothing there. They didn't get nothing. I was hungry all the time, and usually no milk by the time you got the pitcher. And they gave us something called Postum coffee. If some of you are older, you might remember Postum coffee. It's a coffee substitute, caffeine free. So one gal stole a jar of cherries. She was hungry all the time, and she got whipped with a razor strap. And sometimes they gave a choice at this one particular school. You either got whipped with a fishing rod or with a strap. So then this is a tough one. It's something that I didn't think to ask my parents and my grandparents. And when I developed the questionnaire, the protocol, from the Boarding School Healing Project, an earlier organization before that was folded into the Boarding School Coalition. The sexual and mental abuse. The sexual abuse was horrific. What I found is that almost everybody was either sexually molested at the boarding schools or they witnessed it. So Roger said the sexual abuse would happen at night when all of us were sleeping. The brothers would come in and take someone out. When kids would come back, they'd be crying. They didn't want to be touched. They were always scared. No one ever talked about it. So that's one of the biggest secrets of boarding school survivors, especially the men. It's hard for them to talk about having been molested. One lady, she said she was 75 years old. She said, I've never told anybody in my family except my husband that I was molested. And she said, I don't know why I'm telling you. And she was whispering, and we were in this huge house, by ourselves, but she was whispering. And I said, I know why you're telling me, because I asked. So when do survivors of boarding school to this day, right now, that are still living, when do they tell about the horrific abuse they went through in boarding school? It re-traumatizes them, or they don't. The two women did not want me to even send their book or their manuscript back to them in case their kids or their grandkids found it. And they said, I have to think about this every day of my life. I don't want my kids or grandkids to ever have to think about it. So that's why in my book, many of them have pseudonyms. They didn't want to list their real names. Others said, name it, put my name in there and tell the world what happened to us. So that's what I'm continuing to do. So when do our survivors talk about it? So this finding these graves have triggered. I worry about boarding school survivors across Turtle Island here and across the medicine line of boarding school survivors that are triggering some pretty horrific memories. So Josephine said, and it wasn't just a priest that I pulled out the priest, but it was other federal workers that also molested these kids. Not so much the teachers, it was the people that had control of the kids in the dorms. I remember having to serve the priest wine. I'd be brought to the priest's room, but I don't remember ever leaving. Did he get me drunk? I had a lot of problems down there. The priest, not a nun, would bring me to the doctor. She was 6 years old. To this day, I don't like being touched, hugs and stuff, people holding me. Julia said she was molested by 2 different priests. The nuns would come and get her. She figured they chose her because she didn't have any friends and was a loner. If another priest came into the room, the molesting priest would hide me in a closet. Tommy said at Pier boarding school, this is in South Dakota, a matron would watch them shower, make them come in front of her, lift their towels over their heads, and turn around as she inspected their private parts, all in front of the other boys. So, so those are some, just a few of them, it gets worse. Some of the stories are worse. I'll let you read them for yourself in the book. So, some of the students, and some of you may ask the question, well, some people said they had a good time at boarding school, but we have to remember the overarching mission of boarding schools was to kill the Indian and save the man. It was forced assimilation, forced Christianity. So when I hear someone say, well, grandma had a good time at boarding school, usually it's because things were pretty rough at home. They're either being molested at home, or they didn't have running water, or one man lived in Spirit Lake, a log cabin with a dirt floor. They were very, very poor. So we have to look at what's called historic trauma, intergenerational trauma. Historically, what's going on reservations, of course, the absolute poverty, the alcoholism, and so on, that these kids would go to a boarding school, absolute hellhole, and consider it a better place than home. So we have to look at the history behind someone saying that. So, yeah. And I had something else to say there. I'm not going to find my notes fast enough. 11 o'clock. Okay. So what's happening to us today is that it's called historical unresolved grief theory. So it's resulting from historical trauma of attempted genocide, a grief that has not been expressed, acknowledged, or resolved. It also refers to unsettled distress that results from being kept from engaging in our traditional practices and ceremonies, and that can span several generations. So I talked to my uncle. We're talking about something called epigenetics, and some doctor, someone will have to, other researcher, I don't understand it completely, but it's in our DNA, and it's the trauma that's passed down through our DNA. So I was talking to my uncle, he's 96, he just passed away, and a picture of my great grandmother, who I remember. I was 12 years old, and she was close to 100 years old. She lived in Cannonball. And he said, she was mean. And I said, well, Uncle, how come she was mean? And he thought for a while. He said, well, she saw Indian wars. So she would have been born about the time of Wounded Knee or any of the wars that were up in Canada for the Métis, Cree, Ojibwe people around here. And then she would have been the era of being put on reservations also. So so that happened to her, that historical trauma. And then she sent her 4 boys to boarding schools, or they got the stolen generation. And then one of them was my grandfather, and he sent my mom to boarding school. And then I'm of the, what's called a generational, I was not sent to boarding school because my parents absolutely refused to send us there or do to us what was done to them. So I know I have in my DNA all of that trauma that happened within my family. So it's unresolved grief. So in the book, I'll let you read it yourself. I have an essay in there about my father and what I believe was the absolute unresolved grief, his soul wound of having been sent to boarding school. You know, he got back from boarding school. He was the return. He couldn't adjust to being back home. So he ran away and he changed his name to Joe Harper. He rode the rodeos and broke broncs and so on. And then he went into, those of you that are old enough to know, the CCC camp. And then from there, he, after Pearl Harbor, he joined the Army. He was a little bit older. They called him like the old man. He's like 28. So where did my father and where did my mom ever learn parenting skills? Where did they ever learn to be parents? Because they were beaten and made to feel ashamed of who they were as Native people. They tried to assimilate, but they looked different, they talked different. People heard grandma talking Native to my mom, and so they called us foreigners. When we relocated to Portland, another assimilation program, but we were hungry here on the reservation because Dad couldn't find work, of course, during the winter as a carpenter. So we were parented the way that my parents were parented. So Dad had a pretty mean arm with his belt, and Mom would make us kneel in the corner. We didn't have to kneel on broomsticks, but we had to kneel in the corner for up to 30 minutes. You girls get to your corner whenever we were fighting. We weren't hugged and we weren't said that I love you. So that's the boarding school legacy that has happened to not just my story, it's hundreds of thousands of Native people across Turtle Island. So so I talked about disenfranchised grief that can't be publicly mourned. Right now, I think it is publicly mourned because of the discoveries of these unmarked graves. When do you tell your family about trauma, sex abuse, the horrors of boarding school? So what is a format for our people to talk about their grief? So there's So there's something called boarding school syndrome. So it's PTSD, including recurring intrusive memories, nightmares, flashbacks, detachment disorder, deficient knowledge of traditional skills and cultural skills, trouble sleeping, poor anger management, tendency to abuse alcohol and drugs. And we know that alcoholism was our number 1 problem. When I lived in Fargo, when I was teaching at the university there, if I'd see a Native person that was obviously inebriated, on the streets in Moorhead or Fargo, I'd want to jump out of the car and ask them, what boarding school did you go to, or what boarding school did your parents go to? So it's sort of an overarching issue, adverse childhood experiences and so on. There's a whole lot of laws and everything that have impacted us as Native people to where we are the way we are. So the legacy of adverse childhood experience, it disrupts our brain, leading to a higher likelihood of negative health outcomes as adults, including heart disease, obesity, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, and we suffer from disproportional cycles of violence, abuse, disappearance, missing, murdered Indigenous women, health disparities, substance abuse, premature death, and undocumented psychological trauma. So that's the legacy of boarding schools. So now, well, first of all, few more minutes here. What I did, I was part of, if you've heard about the Truth and Reconciliation commissioners up in Canada, I was invited up to Whitehorse, Yukon as an outside international observer of their truth-telling process. And I want to emphasize, the United States has not even begun the truth-telling, not even begun the truth-telling. And they've started it since 1996, so they're way ahead of us. So we were at dinner, and one of the commissioners, Chief Willie Littlechild, he looked at me and he said, "How many boarding schools does the United States have?" And I'm representing the United States, and as a professor, couldn't answer. No one in the US has ever asked the Bureau of Indian Affairs or any of the churches has ever asked them, how many boarding schools did you run? So since 2013, I've made it on my mission to answer that question. And it's a long story, but in my book, there's a pull-out map of the boarding schools that I found so far. And there's 366 schools in this map. I've deleted 12 of them because my research isn't perfect. And if you ever tried to look for a boarding school, you'll understand why. And then I've added more to 406. So since they found my book has gone bonkers. It's sold out, and then we ordered 3,000 more books. But because there's also an issue in China with paper, so we aren't able to do the pull-out map anymore. So we're just doing a map of the 30 states that have had boarding schools, and then a list of each boarding school under each state. Have I found them all? Nope. I found one since now, so there's actually 407, but 406 will make it into the next book. So an example of how difficult it is to just find a boarding school, I went to Marquette, where Catholic boarding schools are. He had 35 huge boxes, well, not huge, but boxes, and each one had files in it. And it would say day school or boarding school. So that's how I found the number of Catholic boarding schools, but I didn't get all of them. There's been more that since have popped up. So, they're in archives. Some of the information has been lost. The names of the boarding schools they're called training schools, industrial institutes, boarding agency, mission school, Indian school, farm, normal, seminary, orphanage, or manual labor. So you have to look under all those names in order to find, say, a single boarding school. So, and the records are lost or flooded or burned. So I need to talk real quickly about where do we go from here? What does healing look like? I'm often asked by all of these reporters from all over the world, what does healing look like? Right now, I think we're in this chest crushing grief, this heart-wrenching grief, this breath-stealing tragedy of having found these kids, these unmarked graves. So how do we heal that? One of the commissioners said, how do you forgive the unforgivable? So first of all, our people are saying that we must be consulted before any action is taken. So for instance, Deb Holland, who is the Secretary of Interior, is a Native lady. She is launching a federal Indian boarding school initiative to investigate Native American boarding schools and the graves. Well, that's one heck of a job, that alone. And she was on a podcast, and she was asked by the interviewer, do you anticipate finding any unmarked graves in the United States? And she thought for a moment. She said, I can't answer that. And she can't answer that because that's a new question. Never in my research did I think of asking, does that boarding school have a graveyard and unmarked graves? Never. So we need more research. But I found about 10 or fewer schools that do have unmarked graves. And so that's new research that has to be out there. And every time a school comes out with unmarked graves, it's going to be horrifying and traumatizing. Carlisle is repatriating the kids there to tribes, which is wonderful. We are trying to attempt, and I'll talk to the tribal chair tonight. We're having an honoring ceremony tonight for a boarding school girl that's we found from Turtle Mountain at Rapid City boarding school. We're hoping to repatriate her. She does have family here. So it's a different process than when trying to repatriate a child from Carlisle, which is a war college. So then also Elizabeth Warren and Deb Haaland have are trying to establish a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policy Act. So they want to formally investigate and document the cultural genocide of boarding schools, study the impact of historical and intergenerational trauma, and provide a forum for victims and families to discuss their personal impact, and then to develop recommendations how to acknowledge and how to heal trauma. So we say that, or I say, for healing, it has to be an individual healing. My healing journey is in my book, that I was able to go on a journey to forgive my father. We weren't sexually molested, but he became a violent alcoholic. So I had to go through forgiveness. He had already passed away, but that was for my personal healing. So families have to go through that. So some of my people have said, we want an apology from the government. And right now we're working on an apology from the Pope, which we don't know if it's going to happen. Some of my people said, it'll never get my childhood back. I don't need an apology. Some people want a compensation. Canada had financial compensation. We can't do that because of statute of limitations, but what would compensation look like? We need to collect more data. We need to support the survivors. We need to locate remains of children on those graves and bring them home. We need to find healing places within our tribe. We're setting up a teepee, and I think they're going to keep a light shining on it for survivors. But ceremonies like Wipe Away the Tears ceremonies I'm hoping that maybe they would call survivors forward if they want to come forward and wrap them in a blanket, say, blankets represent comfort and healing for Indigenous, for Native peoples. But just to have a walk and have survivors walk in that walk is re-triggering to them. So we have to be really careful with some of these walks that people are planning. I was at one recently, and there was a survivor there, and she was from South Dakota, and she was hoping that other kids that went to school with her would be there, but they weren't. So she was there alone. And so she started telling me her story and just started sobbing and crying. There were no spiritual leaders there, no counselors, no psychologists, no one, social workers there. They didn't have those people there. They just didn't know that this would be a very triggering event. So please take care of the survivors that may be there if you're going to do any kind of memorial. They did call around campus. This is a technical college, and they found a social worker that happened to be trained in trauma. And I asked the lady if she would talk to this trauma therapist, and she did. So I was very worried about her. So I'm worried about even tonight with my own tribe. Are they going to have, what are they going to do to, instead of just honoring them, but there may be survivors that show up there that are triggered and re-traumatized. So we have to be careful with even these ceremonies. So yeah, so how do we forgive the unforgivable? So that's where we're at. So I'm hoping that will. So I have a meeting with NABS about the Truth and Healing Commission. So I'm hoping I get put on the board. I'm hoping Deb Haaland will call me and I can tell her where some of the unmarked graves are. Okay, so I think, yep. Oh God, we got one minute. I think I'm going to open it up to questions.
I have to say that was stunning. Thank you so much. And it gives a context to something in which I don't know, even with the context, a person can like fully absorb or fully understand. But I have to say it's a lot more than I had, or particularly some historical things that are really part of the picture that left out makes the whole thing blurry, but you clarified some interesting things for me. But I'd like to open it up first to the other participants. Do you have questions and or comments for Denise? Well, oh, here comes Jace. While they are thinking about it, one of the things I've thought about is as you discover these schools, and it's great that you have the pull-out map, even though, as you say, that they may be truncated when in the new editions due to paper shortage. Can we just pay for the paper or send them the paper? But because I mean, it doesn't sound like, even if you're ordering 10,000 books, it doesn't sound like that much paper to put those in. But that said, is there any way, or what would you think about in every place that you discovered a school having a monument placed there, or at least as many as we can do, some kind of marker?
Yeah, 407 markers. Some of the schools, of course, like the one here in Turtle Mountain, only ran from like 1884 to about 1889. So yeah, it's located. We wouldn't even be able to find where it was, but I don't know. It'd be up to tribes or the the Catholic Church or people or individuals. I don't know. There's some places that do have markers already, and those are being kind of dusted off and fixed up and so on. So yeah.
I guess the thing that comes to me is one, to market, if nothing else, with some kind of short history, especially the part that you opened up with. Okay, these schools were established, and this is like what, and something of what happened there. And the other part is, I think, is like when we know who the people were, that they have some kind of plaque to say this person was, imprisoned here. It just seems like the least that we could do to say, hey, honor those, especially if people died there. It just seems like what was done to them should not be, we should never forget that.
Yeah, well, that's what the people I interviewed said. Please tell the world what happened to us, so that the world never forgets, what happened to us. A lot of the kids were also sent home to die. They were sent home, and so there's no records of them either. But they got sick at the school and then sent home to die. Yeah, there's NABS, the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. What they're working on right now is taking this list of schools and doing research of each individual school, who ran it, the years they ran, and how many students attended, and doing an interactive map. So I think where you could, I'm not sure, I'm talking for them, but I'll find out more when I have a meeting with them about, because I'm not on the board anymore because of statute of limitations and so on for board members. But so they're trying to do just more research on individual schools. They're also trying to digitalize records. But like I said, the records are all over the place. My dad's boarding school records are up in the Sand Point in Seattle. He also has records down in Kansas City, and he also has records here at the North Dakota State Historical Society. So I found letters and records, and he ran away from Fort Taunton. I saw that, and then he was sent to Chemawa, probably so that he'd have a lot further to run away to. So it's so hard to even digitize records for each one of these schools, but I think NABS is trying to do that and do more, because all I did was just list the school, tried to vet that it was a boarding school, but as far as who ran it, what denomination, or the government, that's why we need more research data.
Mm-hmm. It also sounds like some of the stories that you were told and have been, I would say, corroborated with other people having gone through the same thing and being completely, people who don't even know each other but tell the same stories. I would call that corroboration in the first degree. So with some of those stories, and so many of them, it seems that a composite story is ripe for a movie. So has anyone talked about that? Because if we look at American history, social change is usually not, let's say, advanced until a movie is made from the book, because people and I learned this the hard way as a nonfiction writer, people respond to narratives more than they do data, you know? And as a nonfiction writer, I like to just deal with the facts. But to my horror, other people don't like to deal with the facts. They like to deal with the story. That's the way they can make up, they can see it, they can feel it better if there's, let's say, a dramatization of what happened. So I'm just wondering, has anybody talked about doing a movie yet?
There's one that came out a few years ago called Older Than America, and it touches on boarding school. Canada has most of the movies. There's one called, I think, Indian Horse. And
say that again.
Canada has a movie out called Indian Horse, and I believe it's on Hulu or Netflix that you can watch. Again, it's very triggering, but it's an incredible movie. United States, I believe the U.S. right now is working on a movie about Carlisle because there's a famous guy that went to Carlisle, football player.
Football, yeah, because of football. Pop,
and there's a famous, Pop Warner. I can't remember the guy's name. Oh my goodness! But there's a movie I think being developed now.
Jim Thorpe.
Jim Thorpe. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, geez, I wasn't prepared for that question. I've never been asked that question. I'll have to write my notes down. Yeah, so there's a movie being based on, and I hope that they don't, because the boarding schools did have bands and they did have teams, football teams and basketball teams, but Pratt's plan was to bring these kids out into the white community to show how well assimilated they were. So even though the kids were involved in sports, which is wonderful, there was an overarching reason that he wanted to show how white and how whitewashed and how assimilated these kids were into the white society. So that's why he had bands and sports teams. And so Jim Thorpe and the team did really well, of course. So most of the movies and most of the research, everything, all of the documents at Carlisle are now archived. But there's, like I said, there's 400 other 7 schools. No one, the world is mostly paying attention to Carlisle, which is distressing. When there's Fort Taunton here. I'd like to write a book on Fort Taunton, just that hellhole. It's just horrifying there. The Chamberlain in South Dakota, I call it the Chamber of Horrors. It was horrifying. Pierre was horrifying. One of my interviewees, he said that they had to run down and get their own switches, to go down by the river and run back to the school in order to get whipped in front of the boys. And he ran into a nest of rattlesnakes. He could have been killed. He was a little boy. So, I mean, just horrible discipline things happened. So other schools need a lot of media or movie attention. So I don't know if this Carlisle movie about Jim Thorpe is going to show the jail that the kids were thrown into that was pitch black when they behaved or ran away or acted out and so on. So, but yeah, I think there's a movie being made about Jim Thorpe right now, but that's all I know. Other than Older Than America, I don't think there's any other movies here. There's another one up in Canada where the spirit lives, I believe it is what it's called. And a lot of, okay, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you're aware of it. Yeah, hi, Jace. So
hi.
Hi.
Hi, Denise. I saw that. I saw that. Yes, I used to show that Where the Spirit Lives years, a couple decades ago, to my students, and maybe it was a little shocking to them when they were. I didn't show the whole thing, but I showed pieces of it, and they just couldn't believe that something like that could happen in the United States. And and so we used to have some discussion. I mean, I've been doing that 30 years ago. I showed a long time ago I showed that. But I agree with Lawrence that sometimes people feel a little bit not as, I don't know, nervous or whatever if they can see it they can be like observers, in a third place kind of thing, and they can handle that kind of information. And whereas it's because they haven't experienced it firsthand, but they can experience it more in a entertainment. I hate to say entertainment, but that's what it is. It's films are entertaining but they can be educating too, and that'll be interesting to see the one on Jim Thorpe. Because my great grandfather went to school there at Carlisle, and I'm curious.
Yeah.
Nice to see you, Denise, too. I'll be quiet now.
My grandfather's brother also was was sent to, my great grandfather's brother was sent to Carlisle. So another movie that you probably shown, Jace, was The Rabbit Proof Fence, from
Right.
the boarding
Yep.
school issue in Australia. And I am in contact with a reporter from Sydney, Australia, and she wanted to come up for a powwow this weekend, but COVID up and change in travel. But hopefully she'll come here and interview our people here. So the Australian boarding schools were based on Richard Pratt's model, and so is Canada. There's something, I believe it's called the Blevin or the Devon paper that I have, where he came and studied our boarding schools here. I think he went to either Carlisle or Haskell, and then Red Lake or White Earth to study, and then they started their boarding schools there. And the same thing with Australia and with New Zealand. So their models of forced assimilation were based on our models here. So that's another good movie to watch, is A Rabbit Proof Fence. I think the last lady that was in that movie has just passed away. So we need to keep telling a story so that it's never forgotten.
Well, I think those would be important additions, especially in a movie. But sometimes, the movie, the trail goes from data collection, which you've done, into a narrative book, and from the narrative book, a movie. Otherwise, it goes, that happens behind the scenes, but sometimes it primes a movie maker if they can sort of see, well, where do we go, or what do we base this movie on, so to speak. But to me, it seems like part of the healing process has to be the truth before the reconciliation. So the truth has to come out. People have to start to know what happened, because this kind of history, it's not that we just forgot. It was purposely hidden from us, and it's still people are still trying to hide it, even though it's coming out. You have people fighting tooth and nail to cover it up, So I think that those of us who are concerned, I'm certainly looking for a way to put some wind in those sails.
Like I said, we're trying to establish a Truth and Healing Commission, and I'm glad it's not called right now, personally, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because like I said, we haven't started the truth telling in the United States. But what does reconciliation look like? One of the commissioners, again in Canada, said that reconciliation is restoring respectful relations. That's reconciliation, but we're nowhere near that in the United States. Canada's probably a little bit closer, but they're still struggling with even implementing the suggestions or the points that they came out with in their final report. So they also say culture is treatment. So many of us are going back to our culture. I'm trying to relearn my Ojibwe language. Language is medicine. So before we go, there's another document I'd like everyone to download. It's about 100 pages, but to read, because it's really comprehensive report on boarding schools. And it comes out of the Native American Rights Fund. So if you type in Native American Rights Fund and then search for trigger points, but it's called Trigger Points, the Current State of Research on History, Impacts, and Healing Related to the United States Indian Industrial Boarding School Policy. So it goes into further in depth about it's called, I suppose that's backwards now, but it's called Trigger Points, and more into healing, because for them, healing is more going into the infrastructure of tribes. For jobs and education and curriculum. I'd love to see curriculum. I'd love to be able to write curriculum. Right now I'm writing a children's story based on my father's boarding school. It'll be a middle grade novel because of some of the horrors that happened to them there. It has to be for older kids, but I like to see more. Canada has hundreds of books, or maybe not hundreds, 50 books or so on boarding school memoirs and children's books. The United States has one. And it's a children's book. I should have brought it. A children's book that's based on a true story of two boys that were sent to Riverside, and they were from a northern tribe, and they ran away and hopped a train. That's the only children's book in the United States about boarding schools. Sad. There's another good book called Education for Extinction. It also took him 10 years to write that book. And then there's some other memoirs. There's more memoirs that are coming out. But when I started in 2000, there was maybe 5 books on, in the United States about boarding schools. So we need more books.
Well, we're kind of run out of our time, but one last favor, do you have a link that you could put in the chat to that download?
Oh, to trigger points?
Or you were saying that there was 100-page.
Yeah. I just
can you-
encourage people to go to the Native American Rights Fund. I won't be able to find the link. I'll end up kicking myself off. But it's Native American Rights Fund, and then just type in the search bar trigger points. And it's an excellent document, more about what tribes can do for healing, what we can do for ourselves for healing.
Okay. And are there resources for more information as well?
Well, NABS, look at it's the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And I
Okay.
shortened it to NABS because kids were nabbed, stolen. So I
Yeah, sure.
named that. Oh, someone did put a link in it. Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
so they keep an eye on their website. There's a lot of documents. And there's even, I believe, a curriculum that you can download.
Okay.
That's done there. Yeah.
Well, we've come to the end of our road, as the song goes. For this show, I really sincerely thank you for coming on and sharing that with us. I'm hoping that there was something that for everyone here, and that now that we have this information, that we will all look for more ways to act on it. It's not enough just to have something in our head. What do we do now that we know that? And each one of us will have a different thing we can do. We may not all do the same thing. None of us can do everything, but all of us can do something. Let's just do that.
You can buy the book and then pass it on.
Yes, that's another thing. Yeah.
Yeah, we had to do 3,000 more books, and then we did it in paperback. So I think they're available like today.
Okay.
That we ordered more. So yeah,
All right.
pass it on. Just for my people, I promise them I'd tell the world. So help me tell the world what happened to them.
All right. Thank you very much.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we'll see everybody next week.
See you, Denise. Love you.
Okay, bye. I think she got cut off anyway. Okay.